So I have the great honor of introducing Hal Ratner. Hal Ratner leads the global research team for Morningstar Investment Management, the asset management and advisory division of Morningstar, Inc. Ratner and his team are responsible for researching and developing MIM's life cycle investing methodologies, focusing principally on the automated investment management and advice capabilities, currently representing over $80 billion in combined assets under management and advice. Ratner and his team focus on portfolio construction, risk modeling, multi-goal optimization, asset allocation, and use of guaranteed income and other areas related to life cycle investing. Previously, Ratner served as Chief Investment Officer of MIM Europe, and prior to that as portfolio manager and senior research consultant, co-managing $20 billion in mutual fund and variable insurance product assets for U.S.-based clients. Before rejoining Morningstar in 2003, Ratner served as Vice President of Investments for San Francisco-based Empower, one of the first robo-advisors. Prior to that, he was an Assistant Vice President of Global Manager Research for Callan Associates and an analyst at ING Barings Private Asset Management Group. Ratner began his career at Morningstar as a mutual fund and variable annuities analyst, and Ratner's research has appeared in publications including Journal of Portfolio Management, the Journal of Wealth Management, and the Journal of Indexes. He holds a BS from Antioch College and is a member of the Investment Analyst Society of Chicago. So please have a warm welcome here for Hal Ratner.
Thanks a lot. Can everybody hear me? Fantastic. All right, it's 4 o'clock, so you all have been sitting through presentations all day, and hopefully this will be the most entertaining presentation that you see, although I didn't see any of the previous ones, so I don't know what I'm up against, but I hope that you find it instructive and entertaining. Okay, so you've seen the headlines, right? The economy looks very bad. Things are getting bad for people. The president described at the inauguration as America's economic status is essentially, or at least large parts of it, is essentially being carnage. Bernie Sanders, running for the Democrats, took a similar view. Things are getting bad for the middle class. Things are getting bad for Americans on the whole. And phrases from people that have maybe somewhat more credibility than either of these two guys, such as Alvin Hansen, one of the major economists in the 1930s, who came up with secular stagnation, a term that you guys are probably very familiar with. The hollowing out of the middle class from Autor and Dorn, who've done some research recently on what's going on with wages. There's a lot of information out there indicating that things just are not going in a good direction. And here's some data that people use to show that. So this is real median wages going from about 1980 to about a month ago. And as you can see on the top, we have wages for men have actually gone down in real terms since 1980. The wages for everybody in general has sort of stagnated. Women's wages have gone up somewhat, but that's largely because they're starting from a lower base. The graph on the bottom shows the growth rate. I've just normalized everything along the y-axis, and of course, women's wages have grown a lot, but it seems that male wages are declining somewhat, women's wages are going up, and what this graph seems to indicate is that wages are going to be moving toward some lower overall level in real terms. Okay? Labor share of income. So labor's share of income, which used to be considered a constant, so this is the amount of national income that people who work make, has actually gone down since about 2000. Okay, my hypothesis, and actually this is hardly unusual, is that's largely because of automation. We can also see, and one of the supporting factors of that is seeing that in the non-farm business sector, real compensation, let me see if I have mine. Can you see that dot? If you can't, just follow the red line, right? Real compensation relative to hour per work has actually gone down. So productivity, by some measures, has actually gone up at the same time that wages per worker have gone down. Okay? When we think of kind of economic history, right, and we'll get into a little bit of history here, we think about this sort of deterministic almost line. going from beginning in an agrarian economy where all labor was priced based on how, how much tonnage somebody could lift up, or based on their ability to, create crafts, or, make a basket, make furniture, et cetera, to more and more of that labor being replaced with capital. So we have the first industrial revolution and the introduction of steam, second industrial revolution, where we have a phenomenon here that I have on the bottom called de-skilling. That's the concept there, is that going from an artisan economy where everybody kind of made everything by themselves to an economy that was more industrialized. You had different people, working in different parts of the production process. And finally, the third industrial revolution, which is the digital age, which is the part of this timeline that we've just left, because now we're really in the cyber age. Now, this is a picture right back here of economic history, and often when we think of it, we really do this in terms of numbers, or we do this in terms of indices. So these are indices, some of them which actually go back to the 14th century from the University of Groningen, which show GDP per capita, or estimated GDP per capita, for a number of economies going back to 1800. And we have a picture in our head that, this line is always going to go up. And using the line on the top where this red line is here, I've just estimated that the growth rates after this year for the next 40 years increase at the same rate that they've increased in the past. And here I'm using a growth rate of about 5% here, which is actually consistent with what a lot of economists currently think. So the growth rate is going down. The thing that I would point out to you is that for most of this period of time, up until we get to the beginning of the 20th century, growth is incredibly flat. Now, it's hard to read this graph, right, because we have this sudden, like, exponential-looking growth here. But if I were to blow it out for you, you'd actually see the growth during this period of time is actually quite flat, not much change from period to period. Now, consistent with economic theory, productivity, as the global economy gets more modernized, kind of moves to the same level. So what I'm showing here is a number called total factor productivity. And what total factor productivity measures is the productivity you get after you control for labor, for the amount of labor and the amount of capital that you have in your economy. So the more efficiently you're using your labor and your capital together, the higher this number is actually going to be. And we can see that it's risen for the United States pretty steadily during this period of time. It's risen pretty dramatically for India, which I guess shouldn't really be too surprising. It's gone down for Argentina. This is the world. This bump, to be honest, I'm not totally sure of where it's coming from. But by and large, the important thing is you're seeing all of these numbers converge on the same level of productivity. And as they do so, the theory is that overall productivity, as they converge together, will probably go down a little bit. Okay. Now, I've showed you some pretty negative numbers. I can show you some very positive numbers. As all of this stuff happens, perhaps not surprisingly, we see a lot of things actually start to improve, right? So there's a tendency, not a tendency, I mean, it's pretty pervasive, to use this kind of economic information, GDP growth, total factor productivity growth, to indicate people, the well-being, people's well-being. How good is your standard of living? How good is your life? And higher productivity growth is often associated with an improving standard of living. I would argue, as we'll see, is that number is going to be less and less relevant. And this is just a number showing that as that total factor productivity growth number, as they've actually been declining, you've seen a decrease in an obvious measure of overall welfare, which is infant mortality, which surprisingly was rather high in the United States in 1960. Robert Gordon how many people are familiar with his book? Okay, yeah, this is a really good book. Gordon's a great speaker, too. If you ever get a chance to see him speak, you get a chance to see him on YouTube. I highly recommend it. So his whole thing is basically this. It's that, look, for the first part of the 20th century, we had a lot of growth due to technological improvement and due to the commercialization of a lot of technology. So we saw something resembling about people doubling their standard of living each year over 2 generations, and he doesn't think that's going to happen anymore. Now, the reasons he gives are increasing amounts of debt, both public and private debt, demographics. We have people getting older. Obviously, that's going to slow down on growth as well. Concerns about educational level and educational attainment in the developed world, and inequality, because we do see for sure a big difference or a growing difference between the people who have the most wealth and pretty much everybody else. This is a picture of what he's talking about. These are not his numbers, but I reran them and recalculated them because I thought they illustrated his point quite nicely. Okay, so for the early part of the 20th century, you have this very steep increase in growth. This is both a growth in terms of GDP growth and in terms of GDP per capita. And these lines are convex as we move up until about 1980, which means that growth during this whole period of time is increasing at an increasing rate. Okay? And then after about 1980, some people put the number a little bit before this, we see growth continue to increase, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. So this is just data that I'm using to support his argument. He also says, which is a really interesting point, is that the period of highest improvement in standard of living in the United States was about the mid-1930s. So it wasn't a great time economically, but it was a period where you saw much of the technology that had been invented or developed in the early part of the 20th century and the late 19th century become commercialized. Now, let me make this more real, okay? Because these numbers may not be obvious to people what this really means when we're talking about the relationship between index numbers and standards of living, and why index numbers may not necessarily be standards of living. So this is Gabe. He's my 11-year-old son. I couldn't get a photograph of my mother, which is why I'm not using photographs of people. And you'll see why that is in a second. So he lives in the world of 2017, and like most kids his age, he likes playing on the computer. He likes Minecraft. He goes to school. He's in 5th grade with a bunch of other kids. He likes the Cubs. You live in Chicago and you live on the north side. You like the Cubs. If he wants to go visit my mother or any of his relatives, he flies to the East Coast to visit them, and he spends a lot of the time when he can. He doesn't actually have an iPhone, but when he can, he tries to get a hold of my iPhone or my wife's so he can FaceTime with his friends. Okay. Now let's say Gabe goes back in time to 1967. Okay, that's his time machine. Okay. Now, how different is his world in 1967 than it is today? It's actually not that different. Okay. So he doesn't have a computer anymore, and he doesn't have a microwave oven. These are probably the 2 biggest things that are different in his standard of living. Okay, he has a telephone. He has to dial it. He doesn't have a computer, but he does have a TV, home entertainment center, record player type thing. He probably doesn't take funny movies of his friends on the iPhone, but he might have access to a Super 8 camera, and he wouldn't, again, be playing video games, but he would have access to something like a Lite-Brite. And still, if he wanted to visit his folks on the East Coast, his grandparents on the East Coast, he would fly in a jet plane. It's probably the same plane, in fact. Okay. Now, he takes his time machine back to 1950, okay? So 2017, I'm sorry, I didn't describe this to 1967 as a 50-year span of time. Now, he goes back 17 years, and he meets his grandmother, Mimi, that's her. And his world is actually pretty different. He doesn't have any TV, okay? But he does have radio, and he does have, he has a record player and that kind of stuff. He has a telephone. His school pretty much looks not that much different than what it looks like right now. He doesn't have a maybe a Super 8 camera, but he might have a box camera. And if he's going back east to visit his grandparents, he's probably going to take a train and not actually going to take a commercial flight. So his world is pretty different, and he needs Mimi to show him how to do stuff. But it's not so different that he wouldn't be able to negotiate it. Now, you take Mimi and you take her from 1950 to 1900, and everything is completely different. And she would not be able to negotiate this world. There are no cars, right? She's riding around with a horse. And if she lives in Chicago, there's horse manure and urine and all sorts of disgusting things all over the street. The level of filth and trash in big cities is actually pretty dramatic, okay? If she lives where her mother grew up, she doesn't have indoor plumbing. She very likely goes to a one-room schoolhouse where all kids of different ages are being educated there, and will probably, if she gets to the 8th grade, that would be a really great thing, using gaslight. And the likelihood that one of her siblings or one of her cousins has died in infancy or as a child is extremely high, okay? So a completely different world. So in a 50-year time frame from 1900 to 1950, it's a completely different world. It's nothing like it was before. Whereas the 50-year time frame between 1967 and 2017 almost doesn't exist. And the longer, the 67-year time frame between 1950 and 2017 is pretty big, but it's not that big. Get me at it, right? Now, what explains some of this growth, okay? A big part of it, in my theory, and this is the piece that I have coming out shortly, and this is Gordon's thesis about the middle of 5 decades of the 20th century having abnormally high levels of growth. One of the reasons that I would argue is because we had a massive period of tremendous destruction of human and machine capital. The First World War and the Second World War. The Second World War was sort of a continuation of the First World War. Now, what does this mean? Well, first of all, it's obviously easier to build high growth rates off of a low base. If you have nothing, it's easier to build off of nothing than if you already have an infrastructure in place for doing things. But there's another reason, too, and that's because during the First World War, and especially during the Second World War, you had a great focus and direction of investment. So the amount of technology invented during the First World War, and especially during the Second World War, was absolutely tremendous. So what happened is while you had this destruction of human and machine capital, you had an accelerated development of intellectual capital. So then when the war was over, commercializing this technology and operationalizing it was what you had to do. You didn't have to invent it, right? It was already invented. It was just a question of making it happen and bringing it to the market. And that, in my view, had a very, very big, was a very big component of why we had this unusual and then sort of naturally substantial period of growth during this period of time, okay? Now, going back a little bit, like getting back into this idea of the indexes, the phrase the economy was, according to Zachary Karabell, who's actually, I learned recently, won like a Fund Manager of the Year award from Morningstar. He wrote a very good book about indices, did something called a GN search in Google, where you basically can search over all of the documents that they have access to that were printed between, I think, the mid-19th century to about 5 years ago. And what he was able to determine was that the phrase the economy actually didn't show up in any media, like the newspaper, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Examiner, what have you, that was around then, until the early 1930s. And the reason that happened is because when the stock market crashed and the Depression hit, and industrial production, which was a meaningful number at the time, plunged to incredibly low levels, the president, Herbert Hoover, at the time, maybe not that well respected today, but actually a very bright guy and in some ways sort of a modern kind of scientifically oriented guy, made a big push to improve how the government was collecting and calculating economic data. So when we speak of the economy, what we're really speaking of today, and effectively, are a bunch of time series of often survey data GDP, CPI, PCE, all this stuff. It's all time series. And economists that build their models nowadays, not maybe 50 years ago, but before we had this kind of data, and especially now that the profession has become so focused on big data sets and empirical analysis, is really all built on whatever is in this data. The data kind of creates the view in the mind, not just of the general public, but to a large degree in the financial profession and the economics profession of what the economy actually is. To quote, I think this is from, does anyone know the show Word Girl or Super Y? Good. Thank God somebody knows that. Okay, these are kid shows, and I think, and one day, a friend of my, one of my kids said, "Words hold our words together." He was like 3. I thought, oh my God, is this guy like a, Ludwig Wittgenstein? Is this a philosopher? And my wife later said, oh, he got that from Super Y. But actually, this is a really good way to look at the data. Okay, that guy actually, in the corner there is Simon Kuznets. So he was the first guy to calculate national income in 1934, and he was hired by the BEA to help them get their national accounts and to determine the methodology that they used to calculate GNP and a whole bunch of other similar statistics. Now, from the outset, a statistician like Kuznets were aware of the limitations of index data. So one of the things that he cited, which is a good point, is he said, like, look, a huge amount of productivity in this country is created by mothers, stay-at-home mothers, right, who in the 30s where most women didn't work, and most of them stayed in the home and did housework and raised kids. The return to the welfare of a society of this work is enormous. And it unfortunately is literally incalculable. He thought it would be a good idea to try to estimate the value of that work, but the decision was it was too dicey because there was no market price. In a scenario which either he used or it might have been used by somebody else at around the same time, if somebody married their housekeeper and then had kids with them, they would then be taken out of the GDP numbers, even though their level of productivity would actually be going up. So a lot of other stuff falls out of GDP and GNP numbers and growth numbers in general, so black market activities. So in 2013, the ONS, Office of National Statistics, in the UK calculated how much GDP would have changed in 2013 if you added drug sales and sex work, and it would go up by about 70 basis points, which is pretty significant. This was also done for the EU as well. Another thing, too, about a lot of these indices is that initial conditions definitely matter. A lot of the data that I showed, you notice the stuff that started in 1950, a lot of the data goes back to 1948. So again, during 1948, there was a period, a recessionary period in the U.S. So when you're looking at the growth of these indices, again, you're looking over a period of time where the initial conditions, sort of the start-off period for the index, was not particularly good. And again, if you're looking at something right after World War II, you're looking at a recession in the economy, but all of a sudden this massive amount of technological and intellectual capital working itself into the economy and turning into radars and computers and all sorts of exciting things that during the 50s and the 60s added a lot to productivity. And of course, the importance of indexes changed with the composition of the economy. I'd earlier made a reference to industrial production, which was the main thing that people looked at in the 1920s. Industrial production is not a very important index today, and you almost never hear it referenced. Okay. Now, in addition to productivity, there's the concept of inflation, right? This is the thing that kind of got me interested in this subject matter, and this idea that, and there's a guy, Mark Bills, who's done some very interesting work on this. If you're interested, unless you want to read some relatively academic papers, there's one piece that he wrote that's a really nice way where he kind of sums everything up, and if y'all want to send me contact information, I'm more than happy to give you his link because it's really nice work. But it made me think about this idea of how do you disaggregate improvements in quality from actual improvements in inflation. This is an extraordinarily hard thing to do, and it's probably impossible, and it's been an issue since we first started calculating inflation numbers. So the example that I wanted to use here was to just use the price of recorded music. So this is a phonograph record probably from around 1900 or so. And I actually know that this sold for about $1.25. So what did you get for $1.25 in like 1915, 1916? First of all, you got an extraordinarily narrow dynamic range of music because this record was not recorded electronically, it was recorded acoustically. And if you go on YouTube and you like want to find marching band music that was recorded during this period of time, and you may know what it sounds like. It sounds like, you know, there are a bunch of toys playing. It doesn't actually, you know, it may be enjoyable and you get used to it eventually, but the level of fidelity to the actual performance is incredibly low. In addition to that, this record was made out of shellac, so if you dropped it, it was destroyed. And moreover, the more you played it, you also destroyed the record by playing it because the tone arms on phonographs at this particular period of time were very, very heavy. So often if you hear a record that was recorded, you know, 100 years ago, it has this, you know, this sound of like the sea going on. And the reason that's happening in most cases is because as people played the record, they destroyed the record, okay? Now, I go to the 1970s when I was buying records, and I could buy a 45 RPM record for $1, okay? So the price range at this point, by the way, was probably like 1.25 to maybe 75 cents for a 10-inch record, okay? This is $1, okay? Now, what's happened over this period of time is the quality of sound is this is now electrically recorded, so the sound quality is enormously improved. There's like no comparison, okay? It's smaller and more portable, and it's made out of vinyl, so if I drop it, it's probably not going to break, okay? This represents enormous deflation in prices, okay? These aren't the same things, okay? But from a CPI standpoint, I count them as being the same things. And I'm just using records because I just thought it would be an easy, nice way of looking at it. When you look at a much more complex, and then I go to iTunes, right? I can get something for 99 cents, okay? And the sound is even better. It's even more portable. I can take it anywhere I want to. Oh, and by the way, if I want to go on YouTube and listen to all the albums I had in the 1980s, I can do that. And the sound quality will be just as good, and I pay nothing for it, okay? So the point is, and this is really important, is that when we talk about real wages being flat or going down, and we're not talking, we measure those real wages by estimating inflation. And if we're misestimating inflation, we're actually misestimating real wages, and we're misestimating the power of consumption. And when you take when you take this and you apply it to something much more complex, like a car or like a house or like computers are particularly difficult, it's really important to think about them in terms of something called the hedonic framework. So hedonic basically means that you have a set of attributes that you assign to one object. This is used in a private market real estate all the time, where you don't have a transaction, but you can say, like, this piece of real estate has these 5 properties. The last time they, you know, this piece of property had these attributes. The last time these attributes traded, they traded this amount. Thus, you know, I can add a weighted average together of these attributes and tell you what this house should be worth. It's the same thing with a car. I can say, like, okay, well, power steering is worth this, and gas mile, the safety features are worth this, and improved gas mileage is worth that. All of this stuff, if you start looking at it from improvements in the quality of products, show pretty substantial decreases in the price of all of these goods. If we can't measure inflation, we can't measure growth, and we can't measure standard of living. That sounds like a very negative statement. I don't really mean it that way, but I mean it in the sense that we need to think about what we're trying to measure as carefully as possible, or we're going to be making very dumb statements and very wrong statements about standards of living. Now, I had the iTunes thing up there, and this is the part of the point that I think, this is part of the presentation I think is really important. So a lot of the problems with index data have been out there for a long time and have been pretty well known. Again, Kuznets brought up this issue of non-paid labor as not being part of the index, and that was known back in the 1930s. But is the bigger issue now as we move from what I refer to as the terrestrial economy, which is mostly what we've been talking to more of a cyber economy. And they're not the same things, okay? A number of people have looked at this. So Jan Hatzius of Goldman Sachs a few years ago came up with this estimate that we're underestimating productivity growth by about 75% a year. There's a really long and interesting, although I don't recommend reading it because it's an extremely repetitive thing that was put out by the ONS in the UK that's referred to as the Bean Report. And the Bean Report discusses how do we start accounting for the value of these cheaper goods and services, and especially how do we evaluate these goods and services that are actually literally free. And that's it's extremely challenging, but it's extremely important to keep that in mind. So they propose different methods of data collection, the use of sort of artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques to try to interpret data. Moreover, and I think this is actually the biggest problem, is this use of something called administrative data. And that's data that's actually owned by the private sector, right? So data that Google would own, data that Yahoo would own, data that would be owned by the stores you shop at that have a record of everything that you bought and when you bought it and how much you pay for it would be one way to begin to get a better idea of this additional value added. There's things that probably you can never actually price, right? So convenience yield, this is my little joke for people who are familiar with commodities pricing. But as we move from the terrestrial economy, where we have factories that produce things and people that have to walk somewhere to get the groceries, to a model where the economy is happening almost entirely over the internet, using your smartphone. It's happening all in cyberspace. This is by the way, a 3D printer, which probably wasn't obvious that this was the case. But there's no reason in the world that you can't start getting all of or a huge amount of your products via 3D printer, so you don't have to even leave your house. So this compression of space and of time, which you can't really account for in any of this index data, is becoming a much more important factor of how we live our lives and a much more important factor with respect to what our standard of living is. Again, as you move from the terrestrial and you move toward the cyber, the ability to measure that value in terms of dollars transacted goes away because fewer and fewer dollars are actually being transacted. Moreover, in cases where they are being transacted, their actual price relative to the value you're getting are going down. So we're actually in a period of time right now where I think if you look at it the correct way, there's a lot of deflationary pressure where the surplus, where the value of these products, because of this deflation, is actually accruing to consumers. Okay. So this is another kind of back in time example. I think these are really, I hope they're helpful besides just looking at numbers. Okay, so in 1967, right, okay, this right here is about $3,000 in current dollar terms, right? So I have to pay $3,000. I get a TV and I get a stereo and maybe I get a radio in there as well. Actually, it's more than that because I based the numbers off of the 1970s. This is probably closer to $3,200, okay? This is what, like $600 tops or something. It depends how you price it. The pricing is different. This is way cheaper, okay? Now, if I have this, I have all of this, and for the most part, it's better. So the quality of my sound is better. It's much, much cheaper, right? I can shop on here. Half my brain is on here. This is another thing too that people. This is not necessarily always good, but because you can go on the internet, and if you know how to use, Google well, you can pretty much research almost anything you want to. You don't have to go to the library. You don't have to write away for anything anymore. Use the mail. The value you're getting out of this is absolutely phenomenal. So when people tell you that life was better in the 1950s than it is now, they're basing it off of information that they're not interpreting correctly. Okay? So why does this matter? I mean, hopefully it's obvious like why this matters. One of them is treating economic data incorrectly or in an unsophisticated manner can lead to bad behavior for investors and for people in general. You become more concerned that like the world is a harder place for my kids. They're not going to get a job. They're not going to make as much money as I did, et cetera. It can lead to very bad planning and some very bad decision making. Yeah, maybe they actually won't make as much money as you are, but maybe that doesn't matter because they can actually consume a lot more than you can consume. And I have the piece that I have coming out in about a month and a half actually has some more specific data that gets at this. So it leads to suboptimal savings and planned consumption, and it leads to unrealistic expectations. I have positive and negative, but by and large it would lead to, I'd probably assume it would lead to somewhat negative expectations. And while we're all, sort of advisors concerned with not having people be too optimistic and having their expectations be too great, I think it can be equally bad if their expectations are too negative as well. As we move from, I'm going to finish up here, but I think this is an interesting point, and it's very hard to get data on this. When we think about standards of living and we think about how we interact with the economy and how we interact with our world, one of the really important things about moving from a terrestrial economy to a cyber economy is how we price different endowments. So people in this room who maybe familiar with like Morningstar investment management life cycle model is probably familiar with this idea of creating a completion portfolio of capital market assets around a bunch of fixed assets, so like housing, insurance, and something called human capital, which is the present value of all your estimated future labor income. The value of these items changes through time. So if we go back to the noughts, like this is, and by noughts I actually mean like 1900 here, not 2000, most people's financial endowment was actually their human capital, was their labor, ability to work. The amount that they had in housing wealth, the amount that they had in financial capital, that's probably an overestimate, in fact. And then the amount that they had in time as an endowment, which is really, really important. Gary Becker, the economist who actually did a lot of work on human capital, said time was the most important asset that people had, and it sounds kind of like a joke, but it's actually not a joke. It's actually completely serious and part of the majority of economic models. As we move toward the 50s, people have more time, right? Because there are more machines, they have more, yeah. Yeah, exactly, I'm sorry. It means leisure time, yeah, exactly. It means non-working time, okay? They have more leisure time because of, you can get to work faster. Again, because of improvements in technology, you have more time. Your human capital has gone down. This is all scaled, by the way. The absolute dollar values may actually go up. And your housing wealth has gone up as well. The numbers have changed a little bit when we get to 1967. Now, when we get to the future, this is really the important thing, is the value of your leisure time, like skyrockets. Why? Because of technology, you actually don't have that much time that you need to spend doing other things, okay? Even work. Like, think about what it's like to work now relative to what it was like to work 50 years ago, okay? Because we have a computer, I know, personally that I can go on my computer, I can calculate large amounts of data in no time. I can go on the internet and find websites that will tell me how to calculate certain things and what, and often written in the programming language that I want to use, that it's incredibly fast to acquire information and to acquire knowledge in this day and age. And because of that, I have more and more time to do other things that I want to do. Now, I said leisure time, but I should point out that this is somewhat fungible. It represents the amount of leisure time that I could have. Or if for me, like, for example, leisure time is actually doing work to some degree, to doing stuff that I like at work, then that's actually fine as well. But it means that it's much easier to squander this and to lose this than it is these other factors. And I think when you're thinking about wealth for people and you're thinking about how they consume and how they invest, this idea of how they price their time becomes extremely important. And I'm going to come back to this in a second, and I'm almost done here. Now, one thing about growth that we're talking about, there are people periodically that will come out and say, like, well, we've kind of like solved all the big problems. To some, I mean, I wouldn't say that Gordon falls into this category, but to some degree, he kind of does. And I would say there are still things that in the terrestrial traditional economy badly need to be addressed. So one of them, for example, is healthcare, not funding healthcare, but figuring out how to get people to live more healthily. We figured out how to get people to live for a long period of time. We haven't necessarily been able to figure out how to address a lot of the degenerative diseases that come with aging. And this is going to be a bigger problem as people live into their 90s and beyond. And, you know, unfortunately, don't, you know, live perfectly healthily until they're 90 and die, but often spend long periods of time where they're severely constrained with respect to their health. Global warming is obviously a big issue. So if we can't stop it, which seems pretty likely, how do we deal with a world in which we have much more volatile weather patterns? How do we, you know, what kind of technology do we need to develop in order to ensure that, you know, we can live in the world that has a much more hostile environment? And this is going to require a huge amount of investment and a huge amount of development of intellectual capital as well. So I think we still have a lot of, and then potentially growth from an economic standpoint, we still have a lot of work to do in the terrestrial economy as well. Now, a couple of interesting things about the cyber economy. So Johnson et al., who's at the University of Michigan, actually showed that teenage recreational drug use, and actually sex as well, is down. Probably because teenagers have more time. This is how, you know, people, you know, want to fill their recreational time doing fun things, and now they have smartphones, and they're not doing drugs as much, which is actually, I think, a good thing. But there are bad things as well, too. So Aguirre et al. Actually, God, I'm trying to think of his name. Eric, it doesn't matter, he's at the University of Chicago, also worked on this paper as well, did a really interesting paper showing that there's a, you know, I think some of you may be familiar with this. There's a high percentage or a higher percentage of prime age, younger younger males who are not part of the labor force. So they're living with their folks, or they're living very cheaply, and they're working only intermittently, or they're not working at all. Now, why are they doing this? They're doing this because they're spending all their time playing computer games, which specifically multiplayer mega computer games, which involves, you may be familiar with this, but involves a lot of people playing at once. So it's not just like you're by yourself, you're actually playing with all these other folks as well. Now, why is this significant? It's significant, first of all, because people can get a lot of utility out of their cyber exercises. Think of how much time you spend just on your iPhone, right? And it's really cheap, right? So for these guys to be entertained, they actually don't need to make any money. They just plug in and they play for a few hours. And as a result, what happens is what's called the reservation wage, which is the minimum amount of compensation that they want to get a job, goes up and up and up. Because if I'm already having all my fun and entertainment and I'm not paying for it, and because it doesn't cost me anything, then if you want me to work, you better pay me a lot of money. So this is definitely a big concern. It's a societal concern at this point, because at some point these guys are going to get old enough to want to raise a family and you know, not live in their parents' basement anymore, and it's going to be hard for them to find a job. Another issue too, again, is this idea of this increase in inequality as well, which is a function of to some degree, you know, to a large degree, because of the you know, where we're going in the economy with respect to moving from the terrestrial to the cyber economy. But the thing that's really significant about this, that's really important, so when they talk about wealth inequality, in the United States, it has very little to do with standard of living. The American Enterprise Institute did and they're not the only people, there are other people who maybe out there as well, showed that even very poor people in the U.S. have a pretty high standard of living. They have smartphones, you know, they have enough to eat, they have televisions, they have access to the internet, they have access to computers, et cetera. So what's happened through time is since it's about 1900, whereas you look at standards of living for the poor and the very rich were really far apart. We've actually seen those standards of living come together, so they're much more similar to each other. But we've actually seen the distribution of wealth the actual amount of wealth people have actually expand. And again, that's because technology makes everything cheaper. So if I'm poor, I can still get a lot of, creature comforts that I couldn't really buy a better version of if I had a lot of money. But the problem with this, of course, is that high levels and very concentrated levels of wealth also result in very high levels of power. So even if people are living a good standard of living, if a very small number of people are calling all the shots in society, it's not really a good thing. The upside to that is technology can give everyone a voice. And on that, I will end my talk, and thank you guys very much for sticking it out. And I'll take questions if you have any, and if not, I appreciate your time. Thanks. Yeah.
What advice would you give our planners, advisors, for our clients anticipating the costs and, what you say we should do to boost up for
Well, that's a good question. I think general rates of overall subsistence consumption, so normal groceries and housing and stuff like that, is going to be relatively stable through time. I don't think it's going to go up too much. There are things that have gone up a lot, but there's probably an upper bound on it. And these are things where you were talking about true inflation. So I would argue, and again, I'm not alone here, that the inflation education, particularly for college, is insane. Okay, it's through the roof. College education, the quality of education at the undergraduate level and grad has not gone up probably ever. Okay, certainly not since the 1950s. But because of the way schools are financed and because of their desire to kind of compete with the business world, et cetera, the amount it costs to finance college is going up. But there's got to be an upper bound on it, because you're just getting to the point where upper middle class people like me and most of your clients are going to have a hard time financing it without, it gets pretty uncomfortable. And then on top of it, the likelihood in nominal terms of kids going in and making enough money to justify a lot of that debt or that time spent is not going to be there either as well. So I think that, there's also movement in colleges where you see them becoming more. I have a couple of folks who work for me who used to teach, and I have a sister who teaches at the University of Wisconsin. They're getting a little bit more like customer service oriented. And I don't think this is necessarily a good thing, and I think there'll be a backlash to it as well. So anyway, the bottom line is there are a few things where you have seen a lot of inflation, but there's an upper bound on it because the ROI is just not going to be there for college. And I think that's going to end as well. So yeah.
One of your early observations was there's been a really dramatic increase in debt worldwide.
Yeah.
And it seems like at least part of the explanation for the increase in inequality as well seems to be sort of like the 1% is borrowing out, and they're taking a disproportionate amount of that, also the 30 years of falling taxation generally. What are the implications of that? I mean, that does not seem sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually Gordon's point. It's an empirical observation that has increased a lot, but he's mostly talking about public debt. It's not sustainable, and I think that, but I think it's cyclical. In other words, you can only be so much indebted. You can only have so much in debt servicing payments happening before you start to go the other way. And after the financial crisis in 2008, you have some empirical evidence of all of a sudden, savings rates are going up and debt levels have gone down compared to where they were in 2007. They're going back up again after that period of time, but it shows you that there are definitely correctives out there. So I don't think it's good. I agree that it's a problem, but I see it more as something that's sort of slowing down potentially growth as opposed to something that's going to cause a big disaster, if that helps. I'm going to start with you because I think you were the first person.
Is your proposal about labor costs, in relation to GDP?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole area, to be honest, where I have like relatively limited knowledge. But what I can tell you is that the issue with medical costs, when we're talking about quality, is it's actually pretty hard to gauge the quality of a lot of medical. I mean, we can all say that, yeah, the quality of medical procedures have improved pretty dramatically over the past, 20 years. The fact now that you don't need open heart surgery, but not now. The fact that between the 1960s and the early 1980s, you could have an angioplasty instead of getting open heart surgery is a massive improvement in quality. The degree to which that's reflected in the prices, I think, is somewhat debatable. I don't necessarily see an upper bound on. I mean, the medical costs are a lot more difficult in that people treat them really as sacrosanct, which I think does make sense. And I don't see the kind of downward pressure on those that I see with college, I guess, if that's the question. So I think that if I were concerned about rising inflation in one particular area, let's not say inflation, but just rising costs, medical costs would be a bigger issue than college. And the reason I don't say inflation is because I'm saying that you do have this massive improvement in quality, which I think has been the case and will continue. But whether that quality, how much of that is you're paying for the quality, and how much of it is just plain inflation, that's a little bit more ambiguous. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you than that. Yeah. Yes. As a percentage of people's overall wealth, not in absolute terms at all. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it will go up and probably rise at whatever 0.5%, whatever per year forever. But that's just scaling everything, so it's the same. It's just on percentage terms. Cool. Great. Listen, again, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.